So I think it's important to point out the narrative spun by the Western media around, many of these pivotal events, honestly going back to as long as I can remember, from Iraq in the 80s to Serbia in the 90s, and then in the wake of 9/11 from Afghanistan back to Iraq and then Libya, Syria, and then not to mention all of the other times previous to this that Israel has bombarded Gaza. All of these conflicts, every single one of them, when you look at the narratives being spun by the Western media, and it's not just the colonial apologia or justification of atrocities that they do, because they obviously do that, but it's also about this like irrational fear of another and this externalized terror that they try to instill that like attempts to gloss over the fact that any kind of resistance against Western imperialism at this point in time is more than justified. But also, apart from all of that, it's also this othering and marginalizing of Arabic and Muslim people in the West, and this connection to like regular Palestinians or regular Arab people as being a part of some kind of jihad or terrorist faction that's going to activate and start doing attacks. Like it's also similar to what we saw after 9/11, even to the point where President Biden made a startling comparison to the attacks on Israel on October 7th to what he called like 15 9/11s.
Since this terrorist attack took place, we've seen it described as Israel's 9/11. Well, for a nation the size of Israel, it was like 15 9/11s.
So with this, I think it's pretty urgent to take like a second and dissect, break down, and critically analyze the claims that have been made by the Western media surrounding these events that occurred in Israel a month ago and compare them, just like the President of the United States did, to September 11th, 2001. Because look, these dominant narratives need to not just be questioned, but I think rigorously challenged. Both 9/11 and the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel were unexpected in both their scale and audacity. Both incidents also were seen by many as, quote, intelligence failures. In the case of 9/11, various reports suggested that the U.S. had multiple highly verified pieces of intelligence about impending attacks, but still they failed to act. There were multiple intelligence reports before 9/11 suggesting that terrorists, including known Al Qaeda members, were both in the United States and were considering the use of airplanes as weapons. Even despite all these warnings, the intelligence apparatus apparently simply didn't anticipate the scale and specifics of the 9/11 attacks. And the official stance was that there had been no clear indication that the use of airplanes as weapons was such a strategy, though multiple pieces of declassified intelligence proves that simply not to be true. Now, in Israel, despite their advanced intelligence capabilities, they too were taken completely by surprise in both the intensity and scale of the Hamas attacks. Now, just like with 9/11, there were numerous warnings from Western intelligence of an impending attack, which were seemingly ignored. The U.S. intelligence community had previously issued several warnings based on information about potential violence from Hamas, starting with a warning on September 28th about the potential of escalated rocket attacks. The CIA even gave an alert on October 5th about a heightened risk of violence, and a report on October 6th, the day before the attack, noted unusual Hamas activity, signaling a possible imminent strike. Additionally, 3 days before the attack, Egypt warned Israel about potential oncoming violence, though the specifics about this warning still remain somewhat unclear. Even with their extensive intelligence apparatus, Israel was allegedly misled by Hamas's public posturing, leading to what was a massive security breach. The role of the media in shaping public perception in the wake of these types of global terror attacks is multifaceted, to say the least. The way these events are covered, the language that is used, the stories highlighted, and those that are omitted have significant influence on the public's understanding and interpretations of these events. After the attacks of 9/11, the media landscape was saturated with continuous wall-to-wall coverage.
Look, you want to be careful here. We don't want to get too far ahead of this, but obviously this has all the appearances of an extraordinarily well-coordinated and devastating terrorist attack here in the United States.
And while a great deal of this news coverage was simply aimed at keeping the public informed amidst a national emergency, there was numerous instances where the media was heavily criticized. The traumatic nature of the event and the emotional response it elicited were magnified by repeated broadcasts of the planes hitting the towers and the subsequent collapse. Replay after replay was shown to ensure that every single person watching that day knew exactly what hit those towers and how exactly they came to the ground.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Dear
Has
Lord.
just
I did not
hit.
see a plane go in. That just exploded.
We just saw another plane coming in from the side.
You did. That was out of absolute
Yes,
by
and
my
that's
view.
the second explosion. You could see the plane come in just from the right-hand side of the screen. So this looks like it is some sort of a concerted effort to attack the World Trade Center that is underway in downtown New York.
We will see that scene again just to make sure we saw what we thought.
We're going to give you a replay of what we just saw, and I must admit I thought it was some sort of fire equipment coming in or some sort of observation plane, but it was obviously designed to attack the World Trade Center. We're going to show you that. Here's a replay of the videotape. In a second, that looks like a good-sized plane came in and hit the World Trade Center from the other side. So this is obviously, or would seem to be, and again, I'm dealing in speculation, but it would seem like there is a concerted attack against one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
This intense focus on the tragic visuals served to heighten the public's emotional response, and in many instances completely overshadowed the more in-depth analysis of what occurred or any type of investigation into the actual perpetrators of the attacks. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was a surge of patriotism and nationalism. This atmosphere openly discouraged skepticism towards the government's narrative about what exactly happened, not just on both the day of the attacks and in the weeks and months leading up to them.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
When the Bush administration then pushed the idea of Iraq's involvement in 9/11 and weapons of mass destruction, a significant portion of the media didn't even question these assertions, and the few that did, frankly, didn't do it enough. The subsequent inability to find any WMDs in Iraq caused many to question the media's role in the lead up to the Iraq War and the attacks on 9/11, and many conflicts that we've been involved in since then. In the aftermath of 9/11, there was also a notable uptick in the negative portrayals of Islam and Muslims. While some really good journalists worked to support and contextualize the struggles of the Muslim community after 9/11 in America, many other media networks openly perpetuated ethnic stereotypes towards Muslims, leading to a skewed perception of Islam in the hearts and minds of many Westerners. Just as after 9/11, media outlets with certain political or ideological leanings have chosen to cover the attacks on Israel in ways that support their perspectives. We've seen some liberal media outlets in the West, like MSNBC, for instance, have been more willing to emphasize the Israel intelligence failure story that's kind of been brushed under the rug, while the more mouthpiece networks like ABC, CNN, Fox News have mostly focused on Israel's right to defend itself rather than justifiably questioning the integrity of such a bolstered Israeli national security state and its failures in the lead up to these attacks. Another huge problem that I've seen in a lot of this coverage is how, in the rush to provide updates and breaking news, media outlets have completely failed to provide any historical or political context needed to understand the complex Israel-Palestine issue. Without this context, people watching the news receive a very skewed, wholly biased, and incomplete understanding of the events and the historical context that surrounds them. Just as with 9/11, the emotional impacts of these attacks have been amplified by repeated broadcasts of numerous traumatic scenes and stories, creating this environment where emotions are running very high, potentially overshadowing any type of analytical or critical perspectives. The obvious example of this that we could point to immediately is the story of the 40 beheaded Israeli babies. This claim was first aired by an Israeli news channel. It rapidly gained traction across the global media outlets, though several critical points need to be noted about this claim. The first is that the Israeli government themselves have never substantiated this claim, and there is, frankly, just distinct absence of any type of photographic proof that supports these allegations. Reporters that were on the ground at the supposed incident location found no evidence supporting this assertion, and this story has been widely shared on many social media platforms, and many experts in disinformation have cautioned that this story is likely a total fabrication. There's been a mass weaponization of this story where it's basically been used as a rationale and justification for brutal retaliatory actions and a collective punishment against the civilians of Gaza. So again, all indications suggest that this claim about the 40 beheaded babies is just completely baseless and without ground. So it's essential to verify information before accepting it or forwarding it in the heat of the moment, and especially in these types of very emotional geopolitical charged situations. And that brings me back to the president of the United States. And look, I know that people get upset about those who criticize Joe Biden because of his cognitive inabilities and mental state, but like, it's concerning when he goes out on the global stage and makes inaccurate statements in reference to the evidence pertaining to these global terror attacks. Like, not only when he compared what happened, what Hamas did to 9/11, but then to have claimed that he saw photos of beheaded babies in a press scrum with the international media. Like, no such photos exist, Joe. None. None have been verified. And yes, while there have been images of casualties who were children, making such exaggerated claims about beheadings has serious diplomatic consequences. And when the man just goes out there and says like it's a matter of fact, and I mean, I'm always hesitant to make the he's just as bad as Trump argument, but as Trump was on the world stage accusing China of spreading COVID, what Biden is doing in this instance is just as bad of a look, if not worse, because in this instance, he's justifying a full-on genocide of Palestinians. And then that's not even to mention like the source of this information had already corrected themselves by the time Biden made these comments. So like, it's just absolutely juvenile of our government and the leaders of countries of the Western world to be using this kind of rhetoric off the cuff. And look, again, this isn't to say that there has been no harm done to Israeli children. There definitely has been. But like, we really need to be careful about what our world leaders are sharing as firsthand fact, especially when it involves such serious matters like global terrorism. Media coverage often focuses on specific events or actions, sometimes overshadowing the broader context. One clear example of this is with Hamas, is the act of taking hostages purportedly as a part of an effort to negotiate a prisoner swap and a ceasefire. And look, we've heard so much about these hostage takings in the media over the last month, but like, how much have we heard about the fact that Israel is currently holding between 5,000 and 10,000 Palestinian prisoners, of which 2 to 1,000 of them are being held without charge or trial. And the ones that have been charged were charged in a military court that has like a 99% conviction rate. Or how since 1967, it's estimated that 800,000 Palestinians, or about 40% of the male population, have experienced some form of detention. Reports also suggest systemic physical, psychological, and even sexual torture of these detainees, with reports estimating up to 95% of Palestinian prisoners having been subjected to some form of torture. And look, it's obviously gotten much worse in the wake of these attacks over the last month. The number of Palestinian detainees has doubled in the last few weeks, with increased reports of abuse and videos surfacing of mass violence across the West Bank and other places outside of Gaza. The broader international conversation often centers around the return of these Israeli hostages, but without a parallel focus on the thousands of Palestinian detainees, there is an implicit prioritization of which lives are more important and which lives aren't. And like, this is all to be said, well, not to mention, you could easily make an argument that the people of Gaza are all being held hostage and have been for decades. And they're basically being hunted while being held hostage. Like, it's not like they can leave unless they're being forced to leave. And based on what we define as a hostage, I'm pretty sure that checks all the boxes is what a hostage is. And then, while we're making comparisons to 9/11, it's very much worth noting that in the wake of 9/11, the United States Intelligence Agency set up a dragnet across the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, captured numerous so-called suspected terrorists, detained them illegally for years, brought them to an island in the Caribbean where countless stories have come out about a decade worth of psychological and physical abuse and torture, all done completely illegally without any oversight from any type of international rules-based law or anything for that matter. So again, if we're talking about morals or the morals of taking hostages, I think we better look at ourselves and our allies before we start pointing fingers. So like, again, I just want to circle back to this point about how in both of these instances that we're examining here, the media holds a deep responsibility in shaping the narrative about exactly what is occurring and why. And it is absolutely enormous in both of these instances and egregiously biased. And it's like, I'm watching journalists and outlets in the Middle East and other parts of the world are providing accurate, unbiased, comprehensive coverage despite all of this terror. And then the Western media is just challenged by this consumption culture and the 24-hour news cycle and this competition for viewership and this massively polarized political climate that they're navigating. And this is all without mentioning the massive amount of Israeli propaganda that we're inundated with. When combining all of that, you get this very deep inherent bias, not just your inherent bias, but all of the perspectives that feed into your inherent bias. And it will always lead to oversights, simplifications, and distortions. You're not getting any type of different perspective. You're just getting the perspective that you're seeking. So like, I can't stress this enough to people who might have just happened upon this video and don't normally follow my content. In relation to being a consumer of news media, you should always be aware of the biases at play. Hopefully you'll come out of this seeking, more diverse sources of information and being more aware of these biases because there are so many of them. And you can come out of this looking for a well-rounded view of these types of events and not just what the Western media is getting straight from the mouth of the imperial hell dog. And that kind of leads me to another thing. These large-scale attacks often tend to have this effect of rallying behind its public leaders or nations, at least temporarily. And I think that's worth discussing here because, obviously after 9/11, George W. Bush saw a significant rise in his approval rating as the nation, not united in grief and mostly just anger and a thirst for revenge. And it's important to point out, depending on the media coverage and the political narratives that you're following in Israel after these attacks, there has not been this type of huge rallying behind Netanyahu in any way, or any world leader per se, like what we saw in relation to Bush after 9/11, or even like recently with Zelensky previously in Ukraine. There's a staunch opposition of Netanyahu right now. I saw something like 70% of Israelis say that they think he should resign. But with that, there is still this heavy surge in support for Israel, at least among the general demographic that traditionally buys this kind of stuff. There is heavy support for them and for strong, harsh, retaliatory measures and an overall punishment of the Palestinian population, just like how 9/11 led to the launching of the war on terror and everything after that, which, Afghanistan and later Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc. And this is key. While the invasion of Afghanistan was seen as just, basically as a direct response to the Taliban's alleged harboring of Osama bin Laden, the supposed mastermind of 9/11, which that fact in itself is a point of contention, considering that one, the Taliban offered up Osama bin Laden in exchange for ending the bombings of Afghanistan very early on in the war, to which the Bush administration refused. They said, we do not negotiate with terrorists. And then not only that, but Osama bin Laden and the Taliban were literally products of the West's intervention in Afghanistan during the Afghan-Soviet War. So even with this villainization of bin Laden after 9/11, we saw that same type of glossing over of history. But none of that mattered. None of that mattered then, just like none of it matters now, because America and their allies were basically are just out for blood and revenge. And then when they ran out of things to bomb in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq occurred, which for the most part was much more controversial and was served up to the public on the grounds of Saddam Hussein having something to do with those attacks and the possession of weapons of mass destruction, a claim that was later completely debunked by both the international media and the diplomatic community. And like in the case of Israel here, if they were to escalate its military actions after these most recent Hamas attacks, like let's just say that many see this as a way to use this attack as a pretext for broader military objectives in the region, which could very well be the end goal here. But again, I don't really know what Israel wants. I don't even know if Israel knows what it wants right now. After 9/11, the world really did rally around America. It extended empathy and solidarity, though the subsequent war on terror and this illegal, brutal invasion of Iraq painted a much more convoluted picture. While the initial motivations behind the U.S.'s actions were rooted in the seeking of justice and the preventing of future terrorist attacks, the lasting legacy of these wars has been tainted by hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties, a prolonged military occupation, an unanswered question about obvious ulterior motives tied to resource extraction and geostrategic dominance. Fast forward to now to 2023, this Israel-Hamas war carries with it a new glaring spotlight on the unfortunate and egregious casualties among journalists and their families. This brutal assault on the media holds a mirror to society, and it does not go unnoticed. Journalists around the world do face dangers, but the scale and audacity of these obvious targeted attacks, alongside with the tragic deaths of thousands of Palestinian civilians, mostly children, has intensified global scrutiny. Now, following the attacks on 9/11, the U.S. swiftly enacted the U.S. Patriot Act, which broadened the surveillance reach of the intelligence agencies and raised alarms over the erosion of civil liberties. In the wake of these recent attacks on Israel, it's conceivable that similar measures curtailing individual freedoms in the name of national security might emerge, drawing parallels to what America responded to after 9/11. Concurrently, several European nations, including France and Germany, have clamped down on pro-Palestine demonstrations, citing concerns over public order and anti-Semitic incidents. Since the October 7th attacks, both nations, along with Hungary and Austria, have issued bans on such pro-Palestine rallies, with France further intensifying this stance by imposing fines and arrests on hundreds of people following its ban on these protests. Germany's approach has been about the same, with many pro-Palestinian demonstrations leading to the detention of nearly 200 demonstrators in the last month. Across Europe, these actions have faced stern criticism from several civil society and human rights groups who view this as a breach of the fundamental rights of freedom, democracy, expression, and the right to assemble. And that's, I think, really the tipping point in all of this, in my opinion. This clampdown on the expression of Palestinian solidarity, which I think for the most part has not only really radicalized the people who are already advocating for Palestine to get even more motivated to organize, but I also think it sparked like a whole new kind of liberal radicalization of minorities who see what's happening, see how the media is covering it, and are becoming disillusioned to the fact that, like, hey, maybe we're not the good guys here after all, per se. In contrast to the aftermath of 9/11 versus this unfolding climate following these most recent Hamas attacks on Israel, public opinion appears to be shifting, challenging established narratives. Intriguingly, this anticipated trajectory of the shift in public perception has been foreseen by many individuals. But one individual whose prediction is coming to fruition is someone you probably wouldn't expect to be dishing out prophecies about the collapse of Western imperialism. But nonetheless, here we are. In 2004, Osama bin Laden purportedly stated his vision of America causing its own downfall due to imperial overreach. He predicted the country would, quote, bleed to the point of bankruptcy due to continuous military expansionism. He ominously noted, quote, we anticipate a black future for America. Now, I'm in no way saying that Osama bin Laden was like a visionary or revolutionary or that any of these violent attacks that he allegedly organized were justified in any way. But I'm just saying that understanding that statement of America's imperial overreach leading to their downfall, it's a really interesting insight that I think should probably be examined further, especially in the context of this shift in public opinion that we're seeing here in the West and across the world on this issue. Like, I think evaluating the global reaction through the lens of these beliefs about the United States and its global influence provides a really unique perspective that helps understand the dynamic of both these events and their impact on the world stage. Bin Laden, who kind of made his comeuppance as an agent of the West, believed that the Afghan resistance against the Soviet Union exemplified that superpowers could be defeated through perseverance and willpower. In the wake of 9/11, the U.S. encountered significant challenges in Afghanistan, which over 2 decades later culminated in a contentious withdrawal. If Israel were to engage in a prolonged military campaign against any other nation or group after these attacks, it would likely find itself facing very similar challenges of insurgency and local resistance. And I think more so now than anything that's been experienced previously, especially with the sheer heinous nature of what Israel is doing to the civilians of Gaza. There really isn't much choice for these people besides an armed resistance. And so I think that this plays a role into what's happening here and what the end game is for the West. You look again at bin Laden and how other leaders in the Middle East have historically viewed the United States as an imperial power driven by endless military expansion and what he believed would lead to the country's eventual downfall due to this overextension. The U.S.'s interventions after 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq validate this view for many contemporary observers of geopolitics over the last 2 decades. And I think similarly, if Israel intensifies its military activities after these recent Hamas attacks, it would be perceived as another instance of Western associated power projecting its might, which will have a massive blowback against the state of Israel and their Western allies in the Middle East. Just as the U.S. claimed that their enemies were incensed by the presence of U.S. troops in the Middle East and North Africa in the lead up to 9/11, this new presence of a Western military force or influence in traditional Palestine in the wake of these recent Hamas attacks will surely be a new rallying cry for resistance factions. And I think Israeli escalation in its military footprint after these attacks will again surely stoke similar sentiments. And let's just be clear, in the lead up to 9/11, the U.S. was definitely viewed as the aggressor here, exploiting these resistance movements in the Middle East for the purpose of justifying violence and occupation. And in a very similar light, I think Israel's response to these recent Hamas attacks will also be perceived by many in the Middle East and North Africa as an extension of this Western military aggression narrative, especially considering how excessive and disappropriate the response has been and the sheer depravity of the violence that's been carried out, which I think, again, is really the tipping point of the scales here on the global stage. In the aftermath of 9/11, there was an outpouring of global sympathies for America, and what there surely was not was a powerful bloc opposing its actions in the Middle East. And the West basically had carte blanche to do what they wanted there. But, 2 decades later, the geopolitical landscape has increasingly evolved to the point where there is now a formidable global powers that oppose what they themselves see as Western imperial overreach. And with Israel, in the wake of these most recent attacks, they're operating in a much more polarized geopolitical environment where its actions might not only have regional repercussions, but also will have an effect on global power dynamics. And I think while the world has changed significantly since 9/11, some underlying themes do remain. The perceptions of power, aggression, and this sentiment of imperial overreach still resonates deeply in the dynamics that follow in the wake of these recent Hamas attacks on Israel. But like, it should be noted that the stakes are very much higher now, given this evolved global power structure and the complexities of modern global geopolitics. Like, for the state of Israel and the United States and all of the West, they definitely have a lot more to lose than they did in the wake of 9/11, where they basically had nothing to lose then. And I think, like, again, in the wake of these global events that have such immense imprints on the fabric of international relations, it's imperative to analyze the broader implications of all of this, especially when it comes to public perception and the general reaction that we've seen from countries that traditionally oppose Western hegemony, and how what was once indifference is now seemingly like a stern opposition with the horses to back them now, should it come to that. This scrutiny has manifested itself both in waves of public protest across North America, Europe, and much of the global south and in Asia, but also with harsh condemnation from many world leaders who, in a previous era, would have otherwise stayed silent or remained muzzled on this issue. But apart from the statements by these leaders, I gotta mention how these protests and like how significant in scale they are and intensity they've become over the past few weeks. It demonstrates a level of global solidarity for Palestinians that it's a challenge to Israel policies that we have not seen or witnessed in any capacity. You know, it was nearly non-existent at one point, and now it's like there's tens of thousands of people marching in the streets of major cities in red states, you know, like in San Antonio. So like in the US alone, the public support for Palestinians marks a noticeable departure from the past when Israel basically just did what they wanted. But also likewise in the Middle East, where protests that have been often stifled for the most part, we've seen the emergence of large-scale demonstrations, which indicates to me a seismic shift in the political calculus of some of these Middle Eastern countries who are now more willing to voice their support for Palestine. So, like, just to wrap this all up, it's pretty clear that, like, the September 11th attacks in 2001 and these recent Hamas attacks on Israel are two such events, both marked by, you know, trauma and mass loss of civilian life, but also massive geopolitical shifts and profound changes in public sentiment. Well, 9/11 predominantly centered around the U.S.'s place in the world and the specter of global terrorism. This recent Israel-Hamas conflict sheds light on a more complex narrative that exposes the West's imperial overreach and challenges this enduring colonial narrative. And I think that's a really important facet to all of this. Like, for decades, the West, particularly the United States and its allies, have operated under a largely uncontested narrative that they are the beacon of democracy, freedom, and human rights. This narrative has been maintained and prolificated through a mass media and entertainment and international diplomacy and a whole bunch of other really shady other avenues. But these unfolding events that are happening now in Gaza and the broader Middle East potentially seem to be a tipping point, and it marks a global challenge to this long-held narrative. With all the horror and trauma that is connected to these events, it can obviously never be justified or made light of in any way. But I need to say this, and that there is a silver lining to what is currently happening. And despite what our government officials are telling us, that silver lining is becoming more and more apparent as the siege on Gaza continues. And that's the global outcry and protests and challenges to the established colonial narrative that we have been pushed down our throat by the West. It shows that the world is increasingly unwilling to accept this unilateral perspective on Israel and their settler colonial genocidal apartheid state. And I think this recent pushback that we're seeing against this very long-standing colonial narrative, there lies a glimmer of hope in all of this doom, where it's like short-term, not looking good. But if you just zoom out a little bit and look at things where things are headed and where we are headed in a better direction than we were in September 2001, because it's pretty clear that same playbook that they ran back in 2001 is not going to work and is not working here in 2023. So as we navigate these turbulent waters, I really have to begin to wonder, and I hope that it begs the question that this could maybe be the swan song of Western hegemony and the dawning of a shift towards a more multipolar global power dynamic. And with that, a new narrative about the way of the world, which is far more balanced and inclusive of the traditionally oppressed people throughout the global south and the world. Whether all of this happens remains to be seen, and only time will tell. I'm Al Content. Be sure to like and subscribe my channel. Thanks for watching.